Uh, I am Andrew Holden, and I'm the A&R educator in Ashtabula County. And for this presentation, I'm going to be joined by Tom DeHaas in Lake County and Les Ober in Geauga County. So we are all three Northeast Ohio extension educators. And we're going to be talking about introduction to basic soil science and soil testing. Three main areas we are going to try and cover today are taking the soil test, talk about the basics of taking a soil test, and we're going to talk about soil health in vineyards, and then we're going to talk about what is your soil test telling you. So I'm going to take on the first part, and then I'm going to hand it over to my colleagues to handle the second and third part. All right. All right, so taking a soil test. Just out of curiosity, go ahead and put in the chat box if you've ever taken a soil test. You can say, yes, I have, no, I haven't. I'd like to, but I haven't gotten the chance to. I want to see if people have taken a soil test before. All right, we're getting a lot of yeses. Some no, but I'd like to. Yes, several. Awesome. Some people have, some people haven't. Great. Awesome. It's really nice to see everybody using the chat bots. It lets us know that there's someone out there that we're speaking to. Awesome. Yes, but not on my grade plan. Awesome. Just pH. Okay, great. So this first part, if a lot of you have taken soil tests already, shouldn't be too too difficult for you. You're probably already experienced with doing most of this, but I will go over some of the reasons why we need to take a soil test, and maybe if you're not soil testing often, maybe either increase your use of soil testing or give you a reason to improve your soil testing so you can get better results. So first off, I like to show this graph. This is from the Midwest Grape Production Guide, and it shows you the desired ranges for grapes, your pH from 5 to 6.5 or 5.5 to 6.5. And I put in there, some varieties can tolerate higher acidity in soils. So depending on what you're planting, you may want to look at specific pH requirements. Later in the presentation lesson, I think Tom even will talk a little bit about the importance of all these levels, but the main thing I want to draw your attention to is there's really no way to know this information without doing some sort of test, whether it's a pH test or a soil test. But a soil test will give you all of this information. And especially when you're creating a new vineyard or redeveloping a vineyard, it's important to have this information because that's the time when you can make adjustments. If your pH is really far off, if your organic matter is off, if your major key nutrients are way off, it's a lot easier to spread fertilizer, spread lime, add organic matter before you are planting. Not to say it can't be amended, but if you want to make those big changes, you got to do that, or it's a lot easier to do that before you're planting. So other reasons to take a soil test, it's cheap and easy to do. $14 is a soil test kit here at the Ashtabula County office. You can get them at your local extension office, pretty much in every county in the state, or you can get it from a local co-op or feed and grain store. So feed or grain mill, excuse me. Taking a soil test is also the only way to know what nutrients are available and what your soil pH is. Like I said, you can't go out there and feel it. You can go out there and look at your soil and say, all right, this is sandy. All right, this soil has a lot of clay in it, but you will not be able to tell just by looking at it what your pH is and what your minerals are and what your nutrients are, excuse me. We recommend soil testing in the fall or spring. So this time of year is a great time of year, especially if you want to change your pH, because it does take a little while to get that pH changed by adding lime. So we recommend, at least in agronomic production, adding lime in the fall so that by springtime when you're doing your planting, that pH has had a chance to change and the lime has been able to react with the soil. I mentioned already, but it is important to do a test when creating a new vineyard, because you don't know what's out there. If you're clearing land, or if you're using an old field that was maybe in some sort of other type of production, you don't know what the nutrient values are there. It could be highly depleted, especially if it was a hay field or a crop field that fertilizer hasn't been applied to in years. It's also a tool that you can use. Soil test, that is a tool that you can use if you are seeing nutrient deficiencies or other issues in your grapes that maybe can't be attributed to other things. So if you have a specific issue that you're looking for, soil testing might be a tool in that toolkit to try and figure out the cause of that issue. Obviously, we can do plant sampling as well for nutrient deficiencies, but soil testing is another tool, like I said. So quick and dirty on how to take a soil test. If you get one from the extension office, it'll come in a bag, and inside that bag, you will have your soil sample bag right there on the left, and then you'll have a form. You'll have to fill out that form, and then you'll have to fill your sample bag with a soil sample, and you put that all inside the bag that it comes in, and you can mail that to the laboratory. When taking a sample, we recommend using a soil probe, but you can also use a shovel or a spade, and you'll also need a clean bucket. So some of the tools involved. A lot of extension offices have probes available. Not everybody has probes on their farm. Some people invest in getting one if they're doing a lot of soil testing. But if you don't have one, we have them available to borrow at most extension offices. The idea of the probe is it gets a nice even profile all the way down, in that core. And with a shovel, you can use it, but you just want to make sure to try and get an even profile from top to bottom, all the way down to your depth that you're testing to, just to make sure that you have uniformity across all your subsamples. And then the other tool that you're going to need is a clean bucket. You can see that blue bucket up there. Making sure you have a nice clean bucket that doesn't have any residue of anything else in there that can affect the soil sample is very important. Let's see. All right. So when you actually collect your sample, we recommend going in an X or a Z pattern. Before you have any grapes planted, or before you have any infrastructure put up, it's a lot easier to go through and kind of go in a zigzag pattern. Avoid sampling just on the edges or just in the middle. You want to have a fair representation of the entire field. For grapes, we recommend sampling at a depth of 8 inches. What I like to do is take my soil probe and either take a permanent marker or take a piece of electrical tape and mark 8 inches. So I'm going down and hitting that 8-inch depth mark every time. We recommend taking 15 to 20 samples per test, and we recommend taking one test per 5-acre vineyard, all the way up to 10 acres. 10 acres would probably be your max for your vineyard size, as long as it's uniform. So if you have a field that has a nice slope to it, and then half of it is a flat land at the bottom of that slope, you may want to test those separately, because more than likely those soils are different, and the nutrient values are going to be different there. So when you look at doing your samples, don't look at it just from a strictly vineyard A versus vineyard B, but look at it as, all right, this area is the same, this area is the same. You might have to separate it by type of grape. So if certain grapes require different requirements, you may want to separate it that way. And then obviously, like soil condition, if you have an area like we have this graphic up here on the presentation, and it's showing three possible sample locations. So the first one is where all the numbers are. The next one is up to the left. It has a eroded spot there. So they're staying away from that eroded spot because they know that would compromise the rest of the soil test. And then down here at the bottom right, it says sample 3 low spot. So there's a low spot there, and they know that would be different as well. So they're staying away from that. Like I said, if you have a problem area, you can aim that soil test specifically to that problem area to see if there is underlying cause of that. But really, you're wanting to take a soil test of an area that is uniform, and between 5 and 10 acres is really the maximum size you want to test in your vineyard. All righty. And just to go back, I said avoid sampling just the edges or just the middle. You really want to get a good representation of that whole area. So not just in row. You want to not be getting a lot outside, basically anywhere that grapes will be. So, if the roots will be pulling nutrients from that area, that's where you want to be sampling. All righty. So moving right along, once you get your sample, you can once you get your 15 to 20 samples, you put it in your clean bucket, mix all those together. And once mixed thoroughly, you can take 1 cup, depending on your soil test, you might need more than that. But as you can see by that picture, ours requires 1 cup approximately of soil, and you can put in that bag. We don't want you to put that in the oven or microwave or dry it out anyway. It'll get dried out at the testing facility. If you decide to dry it yourself unnaturally, then that can cause issues with your results. So put it in the bag, fill out your form, like I already mentioned, and then mail your entire kit to the testing lab. Then all that's left is you have to wait for your results. So it shouldn't be very long waiting for your results. Usually we expect a week to 10 days. And if you get it at the extension office, if you get your soil test at the extension office, we get a copy as well. So you can take a look, and we can take a look at the same time, and we can, if you have any questions, you can give us a call and we can discuss it. So I probably went a little long on this section, but we're going to move right along to our next one. Like I said, if you have any questions, go ahead, put them in the Q&A box. We'll try and get them answered once our presentation is done. But I'm going to hand it over to Tom DeHaas in Lake County, and he's going to get started on soil health.
Can you hear me, Andy?
Yes.
Okay. So Andrew's going to advance the slides. He kind of has control over all this. So my name is Tom DeHaas, and I'm an educator for Lake County, and I work with a lot of mostly nurseries and some of the other growers, but some with grapes too. So next slide. So the first thing and Andy talked about it a little bit, Alice, I hope is going to cover it pretty extensively, but the idea, what do you do with bare ground? So the first thing is looking at cover crops. This was actually a sweet corn field, but again, they have ryegrass to cover that up. You don't want wind erosion in the wintertime. You want to preserve your soil as much as you possibly can. Next slide. So there are a lot of different cover crops that you can use. Radishes have become very common because they have a very deep taproot, and they can kind of get down into the hard pan of the soil and break that up a little bit. And you'll notice in this particular slide that in the foreground, you have the radishes that are growing there, but you also have the grapes in the background. So, again, that kind of preserving the soil, you don't want bare ground. Next slide. This is a combination radishes and clover. So the radishes break up the hard pan, and the clover helps to build soil. I think they're advancing on their own there, Andrew, but maybe not. You actually see the two. You actually see that radish, a pretty good developed root, and it broke off when I pulled it out. But then you have the clover right next to it. So a really good combination of two cover crops that you can use to help to build that soil. Other crops that they use in the nursery, Sudan grass, they use sunflower, but this is a good combination if you're trying to build open ground before planting. Next slide. So basically if you have not put your grapes in, site selection is really important, but Andrew hit it right on the head. There's no way to know what the soil is like unless you test it. So pretty much your site selection is going to be based on, a lot of time it's going to be based on topography. So I know in the Grand River Valley region, most of the more mature grape growers, we don't call them old timers, but they will say that if you see the lake from your vines, or if there's a line of sight, that there's less chance of frost damage. Next slide. So a lot of times you'll see vineyards kind of up on the high ground, and then as that cold air washes, it kind of flows downhill and many times north, and helps to keep the vines on the top of the hill. So site selection from the standpoint of vines is really important, but also soil selection. Next slide. And again, the wind fans will help, but again, if your grapes are in a low spot, that's not really going to help you to basically add airflow to that, because that's where the frost is going to settle. Next slide. So actually, this is a vineyard. I actually took samples from 2 different vineyards. So this is one particular vineyard. And these vineyards are actually less than, as the crow flies, 3 miles apart. Next slide. So this was actually one of the vineyards that we took a soil sample from. And the other vineyard that was in a couple of previous slides is literally 2 miles away. Next slide. So when I actually took the soil sample, so this is vineyard A and vineyard B, I physically took a soil sample, and they looked identical. Next slide. So if you look on a sideways view on this, the one on the far left side, they look identical. That one had a little more moisture in it, but they look identical. And one of the ways that what you can do with soil sampling, you can do a physical soil sample where you actually take it and you shake the sample and you determine how much sand, salt, and clay is in there, which will give you a little bit of indication on structure. And Les is going to talk a little bit about the importance of clay in your mix. But really, next slide. When we look at the soil sample for vineyard A, which was on your slides on the right-hand side, we see a pH of 7.4. Now, when I first saw this, I was kind of, wow, that's kind of alarmingly high, because typically our pHs in Lake and Ashtabula Lake County are going to be in that kind of a 5.5 to 6.5, that kind of a range. And Andrews, somebody said they lost sound. So the thing that I would say is that you really can't tell by just looking at the soil. The phosphate is a little low, but potash is good, magnesium is good, calcium is good. So next slide. Can you hear me, Andrew? Next slide. Andrew?
It should be on the net side though.
Oh, okay, vineyard B. Sorry, my bad. Didn't see it advance. But look at the soil pH here. So literally 2 miles away from each other, and the pH drops almost 1.1 points. And again, phosphate is low, potash is good, magnesium is good, calcium is good. The question is, how do we know what the pH is going to be? And pH, as Les is going to talk about, is hugely important in nutrient availability for the vine. So if you don't know your pH, you're just guessing. So the next slide. And that's exactly it. Don't guess soil test. The cost of soil testing is so minimal compared to what you're going to do as far as inputs, that it's just I can't imagine why it's not worth spending the $14 and spend that for 4 or 5 different soil tests and getting back actual true results. You probably make it up in one application of fertilizer in knowing exactly what you want to put down. So that so site selection and soil testing, I just encourage you to do that. That for those of you that do it, you know the value of that. For those of you that haven't done it or are on the fence of doing it, please go ahead and do that. And we will be glad to help you with any interpretation of those results in any of the extension offices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Les.
All right, Les, are you able to unmute.
Do that.
There you
All
go.
right. Any feedback, Andrew? We were having a little trouble before.
It's a lot better now.
Yeah,
Okay.
it sounds great.
All right. Very good. Thank you. My name is Les Ober, extension educator from Geauga County, also a certified crop advisor, and primarily do work in agronomic work, but I also do some horticulture. Go ahead. Next slide. Okay, pass that one up because in the essence of time, we're not going to spend time on that. Go to the next slide. Okay, this is what we're looking at. When we get a soil test back, this is basically what we're looking at: pH, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, magnesium. These are the things that are really important with grapes. You can see the values in red. Those are the ones that Andrew gave you. You're also going to see cation exchange capacity and base saturation. And so another thing to notice is that these are in pounds per acre, and sometimes you will get soil tests back that are in parts per million, ppm. Simple conversion. If it's ppm times 2 gives you pounds per acre. If it's pounds per acre and you want ppm, divide it by 2 and you'll get the ppm regulation. Okay. We're also looking at base saturation. Cation exchange. Cation exchange tells us a little bit. Okay. Cation exchange tells us a little bit about the soil. When you have a high CEC, typically you have a lot more clay particles. You have a lot more clay particles in the soil. It's a denser soil, a little heavier soil. When you got a low pH, low CEC, excuse me, it will probably have more sand content and be less dense. The other thing is, when we work with cation exchange, what we want to do is we want to know that we want to transfer one form of cation to another form. In other words, basically particles are made up of negative charges. And when we have negative charges, a lot of times in a low pH situation, we'll end up with CECs that are down. You'll end up with a low saturation, high levels of hydrogen on those particles. As we add lime, calcium carbonate, we begin to increase the CEC on that. We start to see the saturation go the other way. We have base particles of calcium, magnesium, and potassium begin to take over the sites. Let's move on to the next slide. You'll see this in greater. This was the. I will look at this. We'll look at this at the end of the program. Move on to the next one. Okay. So in a normal pH situation, what are we trying to do here? We're trying to get a neutral as we can. That's 7.0. When we go down to 5, we're down on the acid side. When we're up to 7 or 8, we're on the basic side. Most agricultural soils are going to run between 5.5 and just a little over 8. Okay, the next slide, please. When we have soil pH, we have neutral. Here's an example of some plants you might be familiar with that grow at different. This is a big issue because some plants grow real well. You couldn't have on that soil of 7.4, you couldn't grow blueberries on there. You could grow tomatoes. A lot of, for example, white pine would not grow very well on there. So specific cultivars, in the case of grapes, like to grow at different pHs. This is something to keep in mind. Next slide. Here's an example of what happens when we get out of balance in our soil. We go to the acid side, we got a 5.0, we get down towards 5, you can see that we no longer have the availability of nitrogen that we would have. We get down to phosphorus, we lose the ability to get the availability of phosphorus. Potassium's not as critical, but we're starting to lose availability. We're also gaining things that we may not want, for example, like iron or aluminum that can cause toxicity to the plant. And the same is true when you go the other way and you start getting too basic. Next slide. Here's the example of that clay particle that I was talking about. Every one of those clay particles has negative sites all the way around. On a soil that's tight with about we had a 17.8 on one of those tests. I think it was on the A test. That is loaded with sites. And in an acid soil, all those sites take on hydrogen, and it becomes very hard to move that away. And then you go to the other extreme, where if you had a sand particle, and if a lot of grapes are growing on soils that are high in sand, and in fact, they're either on alluvial deposits, or they may be next to Lake Erie or someplace like that. That is an area where where you may have a lot of sand. So you can see that we either have to be a little bit with a soil test, know where we're at, because if we get to the point where we have sand and we don't have a lot of these sites, that calcium we use to take out those hydrogen particles is going to disappear on us real fast. On the other hand, if it's high clay, it's going to take a long time to remove hydrogen and replace it with calcium. Next slide, please. Here's the final slide, and this is the take home on this. This is the slides that Tom showed you. Here's my concern, and you can see this, and I've also put in, you can see here where if we get too acid, we're going to start, or too basic, we're going to start seeing a decline in some of the micronutrients that we may need. So when we go on to the next slide, Andy, if you would, please, Andrew. Here's my comparison. Vineyard B is typical soil test. pH is at the desired level. CEC is at 11.5. There is a deficiency in phosphorus, and that needs to be corrected. But the percent base saturation is adequate. In other words, you're going to see calcium levels, which you need for grapes, up around above 65 and pushing towards 80. In other words, that level is, that base saturation is for calcium is high. The ratio we want is probably about 65, 15 to 5 in calcium, potassium, magnesium and potassium. Vineyard A, the pH is very high for this area. At this level, it will start to limit the nutrients that you have available. It is significantly above the desired level for some cultivars that may only want to have maybe a pH of 6.0. The CEC is 17.8. What does that tell us? We don't want to put any more lime on here. The more lime we put on, the more pH will the pH will go up. It'll only cause an increase, and it's going to take quite a while for it to come down. If we get into a situation where we do not have enough calcium, we start losing calcium, but the pH is still high, then we might want to take a look at running it on a battery on here. We might want to take a look at putting in something like gypsum or something like that. There's other amendments that we can use. But anyway, high pH is not always the desire. We try to keep it between 6 and 7. I think you're okay. I'm going to let it go with that because we're running late on time. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Tom, thanks, Les. And thank you, Tom, as well. So that concludes the first presentation